about global warming. With this thing on, it's kind of difficult to believe whether it's global warming at all or not. Does anyone want to say anything about that? It's looking at that, means this part of the world around this time is generally cold, generally chilly, is okay. But means just before the lecture, I was talking to some of you guys that we were not expecting this much of rain around this time. The rain season is around November or something. Okay. We're having the rain season here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, with climate change, like, even though the temperatures increasing, extreme heat and extreme heat,
Right.
both. That's why they changed the name. Well, like, they tried to stop calling it global warming, because it's not always.
And increased winter precipitation, that's a trait of climate change.
And also, this is the first time it's rained since you've been here. Like, everywhere has a storm like yours.
When we were here last year, it was really cold, but we didn't have any rain. We were really dying for rain. But we need some rain for our plants in November, December, September also. One of the misconceptions about climate change is when we talk about climate change, when we get to hear about the thing, we keep on thinking it's always a drop in precipitation or bump in the temperature. It's not necessarily that way. Drop in precipitation, bump in temperature, yes, those are common traits of climate change. But getting precipitation at unusual times, heavy rainfall, which leads to landslides at sometimes, that's also some traits of climate change. In one line, it's kind of difficult to predict climate change, predict precipitation patterns or fluctuations in ambient temperature. That's climate change, and that's what scientists are more worried about. That if we cannot predict a thing, how can we set up rules, policies, and management strategies based on that? Means if you flip through climate literature, you see that there are various statistical models on climate change, but those models only work for little geographic regions. They have to be contextualized, typically to region-specific things. Global models, they work, but then you have to scale them down. So the trait of climate change is that it's kind of difficult to predict, which makes the work of the lawmakers, policymakers really challenging that what to do in the next 10 years, 5 years, how to tackle the social consequences. The law, climate change has emerged as a major security threat. We'll be having a few slides on that, but as I said, climate change, even the social consequences of climate change is a vast kind of thing, taking into account so many different things. So we'll try to touch upon a few things so that we can send some certain messages across. Okay?
So this is a quote by Ban Ki-moon, who is the 8th General Secretary of the United Nations, and his thoughts about global warming and climate change. He says that global warming and extreme weather conditions may have calamitous consequences for the human rights of millions of people. Ultimately, climate change may affect the very right to life. Developed countries have an obligation to prevent and address some of the direct consequences that climate change may reap on human rights. So basically, climate change is affecting human rights. So the basic human rights, right to good food, right to good water. So all these things are being challenged by climate change nowadays. And it's mostly the developed nations who are at more risk from climate change than the developed nations, because the developing nations don't have funds. That's the main reason. Developed nations need to fund the developing nations in order to fight climate change. It's in financial help, infrastructure help, capacity transfer, knowledge transfer. Everything has to come from the developed nations to the developing nations in order to fight climate change. In all the recent climate workshops and climate conferences that have happened, including the Paris Summit of 2015, everyone agreed unanimously that yes, the developed nations need to help the developing nations to fight climate change, and that's what we are lacking. Even in India, the government came up with certain plans, but due to lack of funds, we couldn't implement those plans. We are still looking for funds to implement those plans for the sensitive people, the climate sensitive areas and the vulnerable people.
We will be coming to that because that will be the main course of this lecture. That how we can develop some policies which will be conflict sensitive. So that's a major buzzword in climate studies now, that we can figure out management strategies to address climate change. And the question is whether these management strategies are going to be conflict sensitive or not. The main issue is that whether those management strategies will whether we can kind of uniformly apply those management strategies to all sections of the society, irrespective of education, irrespective of bank balance or anything. But before that, we just want to chalk out a few things typical of India. In India, we have delineated a couple of zones which are more sensitive to climate change. There are basically 4 zones. First is up top in there where we got the mountains and snows. On the northeastern region is the northeast zone. We got a huge coastal belt which is typically sensitive to climate. And on the western side of India is the Western Ghats. That's a famous mountain range in there. It includes the coastal belt too. So next couple of slides will just show you that what kind of climate consequences we're expecting in these typical zones. Okay.
So these zones were identified by the Ministry of Environment and Forests in India in 2010. They identified to the next 20 years which areas of India would be most sensitive to climate changes. And they came up with these 4 regions: the Himalayan region, the Northeast region. The greenish grey shades, those represent the sensitive regions. The Himalayan region, the Northeast region, the coastal zone, and the Western Ghats. And they identified 4 key sectors where these climate sensitive zones will be most affected. They are human health, water, forests, and agriculture. Those are the 4 important sectors that they have identified where climate is going to influence the most in these regions. So we'll just show you 2 tables where how this climate change is going to impact in these regions. When we look at the Himalayan regions, we see that the climate parameter that is mostly going to change there is that the temperatures are going to rise there. The Himalayan region is a region of snow. All the snow is melting, so the temperatures are rising. And what are the ecological impacts there? It increases in forest fires and also increases in glacial melts, as I told you. So what happens when there's increase in forest fires? What happens is the Himalayan region is a huge source of wood. They use that wood for fuel. They use that wood for heating them up during the cold season. And when there's forest fires, all that wood is gone. So what happens is because of this loss in wood, they lose for fuel, and they also are exposed to extreme cold. They don't have the heating resources anymore. Also, because of the glacial melts, there's a large amount of flash floods, landslides, which means that they're losing out their agricultural area. So when you lose out agricultural area, it means that food security is a big question. They're threatened by food security. And also, in this part of the world, we have a lot of vector-borne diseases, caused by mosquitoes like malaria and dengue. It's on the rise. In the last 4 or 5 years, malaria and dengue has hit India like anything. A lot of deaths due to these diseases. And it's also related to climate change. Those diseases are predicted to be on the rise every year if climate change happens like this. So when we go to the next region, which is the northeastern region, we go back a slide. So this is the northeast region here. So what's happening in the northeast region is again temperature increases, decrease in winter precipitation, increase in summer precipitation, also the nighttime temperature increases. The most pronounced effects of climate change globally is increase in temperature, increase in sea level, decrease in precipitation, increase in events like cyclones, storms, tsunamis. So these are the general things that are occurring all over the world due to climate change, and India is no exception to that. So what are the ecological impacts in the northeastern region because of these changes? Because of decreased winter precipitation, their crops are affected. There's decreased rice production. Their tea plantations are affected by soil erosion because there's too much of rain over there. So there's landslides, there's soil erosion. So this northeast region is all again on the hill slope. So there's a lot of tea plantations going on in there. So because of the soil erosion, this tea plantation, which is a huge source of income to the people in the northeast, it's affected by this soil erosion. Again, increased runoff and landslides due to summer rain and decreased yield. So there, again, when you have decreased rice production, decreased tea plantation, decreased yields, what means is that their economy is affected. That means unemployment, because most of these people are dependent on agriculture. In India, 70% of the people are dependent on agriculture. So when the agriculture produces goes down, that means there's more unemployment, and which means there's also more migration of these people from these regions to other parts of the country. Also, again, increase in malaria due to rising temperature and humidity. Malaria is again one more disease that we just talked about. Malaria and other vector-borne diseases.
Okay, we'll stop for a minute. We'll give you a minute. If you want to copy it down, you can do it. We'll just.
Can we actually get the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yes. We'll try to convert the
But we
PowerPoint to PDF, like things
But
like
we
that.
will need your where to send it. Like,
We should be able to show.
Alright, that's great. In that case, we'll move on. But if you guys still want to copy down. We'll just go slow. We'll just slow down. We'll just slow down a little bit.
You need the previous one? No, I got it. So now we move to the Western Ghats, which is this region. This region which covers from Bangalore to Mumbai. I don't know if you're familiar with these cities, but these are pretty famous cities in India. So what happens in the Western Ghats is that again increase in temperature, increase in rainfall in certain parts, decrease in rainfall in other parts, which affects again their crops, because crops like cash crops such as tea and coffee again because of unpredictable rain. Whenever there is unpredictable rain, crops are the ones which suffer the most. And again flooding and soil erosion due to increased rainfalls. And what happens, the human impacts, in terms of human impacts, we see loss in lives and livelihoods, unemployment. Again, whenever crops are affected, there's more unemployment there. The coastal zone. Coastal zone is the zone which is through the coast. And this is the area where it is, coastal zones are the most sensitive in terms of how the, so this is the coastal zone area. And all along the coast, okay. So these are the areas which are the most sensitive to changes in climate change. Why are coastal areas most sensitive than other areas we are talking about? Why do you think coastal areas are more sensitive than other areas? Yeah.
Rising sea level.
Exactly. Rising sea level. This means that huge number of people are actually getting displaced. Rising sea levels. In the next few decades, I think, I'm sure you know that some of the countries might just disappear from the face of the earth if climate change happens at this rate. Countries like Bangladesh, Maldives, even some places in India, some places in US, all over the world, there will be a huge impact if the sea level rises at this rate. Some of the, we will not be able to see some of the countries, like they will just disappear. So India is also no exception to that. So all the coastal zones are again prone to flooding, temperature rise, increase in sea surface temperature, increase in rainfall, rising sea levels, again more cyclones, more storms, like more erratic rainfall patterns, more erratic weather patterns are seen over there. And what happens in terms of ecological impacts is that all along the coastal areas of India, we have coconut plantations, which is a source of income for them. We get coconut trees only along the coast in India. So these plantations are affected by increasing rainfall, in rise of sea level. And what happens due to sea level rise is there's a lot of salt which goes into mainland. So what happens is the soil gets affected, the soil becomes saline, so crops cannot survive in those soils. So we need like salt resistant seeds to survive in those soils, and which are expensive, so not many farmers can afford that, because it's a separate breed of seeds that they need to buy, and they need a whole lot of money to do that. And again, some native ecosystems like the mangroves, they are disappearing. Mangroves are disappearing because of rise in sea level. And when you look at the human impacts, you see now a lot of increase in waterborne diseases like cholera because of salinization of the water. Changes in agriculture affects the employment, tourism, fishing sectors. All along the coastal areas we have a lot of tourism industry, fishing industry, agriculture, all those are affected. And also because coastal areas are flooded, it's forced migration. People have to move from one place to another. They cannot stay there, so they have to find a shelter somewhere else, which is a foreign place to them, and they have to get settled to this new place, which is a whole new story of climate refugees. I don't know if you've heard about the term called climate refugees. It's people who are displaced from their own place, and they have to go and find shelter and start their life in a totally new place.
What she was talking about is basically how climate change can get into the way of living life. We'll be talking about social justice, right to humanity, things like that. But in India, the major job prospect is farming. 70% of India's 1.2 billion inhabitants depend on farming. But recent studies show that with this kind of climate change, or kind of climate change projected for the next 20, 30 years, rice and wheat, these are the two main cereal products in India. A lot of people consume the cereals, rice and wheat. Not only that, a lot of people are involved in terms of job in rice and wheat production. But these two things are going to take a nosedive with the climate change. So that's weird temperature, weird precipitation in there. At the same time, we are expecting to have some droughts in India, which will be having similar effects on crops. Lower the crop yields, while excessive rains in other areas and destroy the other produce. So this is kind of thing we were talking at the beginning of the session, that we are expecting rain in places where we never expected it. We are expecting droughts in places where we never expected it. So it's kind of difficult for the landowners, the croppers, the farmers to predict that, okay, if I am planting this crop this season, will it be giving me adequate economic return? Whether the crop will flourish or not. Because in the middle of the season, something will pop up all of a sudden, and the big scientists will come and say that we told you not to do this. The scientists never do that until the crop is dead. Unpredictable weather, crop failure, death led to at least 250,000 farmers taking their lives between 1995 and 2009. Now, the last line, what the last sentence says, that unpredictable weather, crop failure, this pretty much go hand in hand. The third one, and debt. Now, in India, peculiarly, we do not have a formal crop scheme, crop protection scheme, crop insurance scheme. So what the farmers do, basically, they go to the local money lenders who can lend money at excessively, exorbitantly high prices, high interest rates. But the farmers think that, okay, if we have to go to the bank, they will be asking for this kind of formal documents, pictures, ID proofs, and everything. So it's better to go to this person who I know who will be guaranteeing me the money without asking for any documents. So basically, instead of going to the bank, they go to the local money lender, who's a bloodsucker, basically, and he keeps on coming back to this person intergenerational way. So it's a cycle of intergenerational poverty and debt starts. So basically, farmers been dying or taking their lives through the past 2 decades in India, which really saw the spikes in the last 6 months, I'd say.
And each year the farmer thinks that next year the weather might be better, my crops might just succeed. I'll have more yields I will have, so I will be able to pay off the debt. But each year, due to climate change, what is happening is that what he's thinking is not happening. His yields are actually going down, and he's not able to buy the high yielding variety of seeds. He does not have water in his fields because the water resources are exhausted. So what happens is that the debt is just accumulating over and over. So between 1995 and 2010, we saw like about 250,000 farmers who committed suicides, and it is on the rise. So there's more farms. So the government is trying to come up with different schemes so that they can waive their loans, help them out, because this has been a terrible situation in India, especially along the western coast of India. It has been a terrible situation. A lot of people took their lives because of debts.
Okay, so we'll move on, but with this slide, what we are basically trying to tell is that what we started out saying, that there are social consequences, lack of social justice in India. So this slide kind of gives you a brief idea how there is a mismanagement between climate change and ensuring social justice. A lot of times we fail to see the connection in there until it's too late, and that's what happened in India. when farmers are taking life, the climate, crop, unpredictable weather coming in their way of living normal life, healthy life, then we are figuring out that what it is creating in terms of social dynamics changes, changing the social dynamics in there, social chaos, unrest. So we were just briefly talking about mean sea level. Mean sea level is rising all over the world. There is a regional outlook assessment, which is called Global Environmental Outlook, short from GEO6, which says that what's the impacts of climate change projected to occur in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, basically the whole of Asia Pacific. The prediction says that 7 of the most vulnerable countries, vulnerable to mean sea level rise, 7 of the 10 most vulnerable countries worldwide are located in the Asia Pacific region. And they give an account that what could be the approximate population in days ahead that will come under the effects of sea level rise in India, Bangladesh, China, and Philippines. Now, these countries are known for their wonderful oceans and beaches. But for India, it's about 40 million people. Now, these are the ballpark things. Means it could be a little less, could be a little more. Bangladesh, 25, China, 20, Philippines, 15. So by far, India beats the tally. It's happening because we are seeing predictions by NASA, NOAA, what they're saying that there are recurrences of storm surges in the past 2 decades, and we're expecting to see more severe storm surges in the next couple of decades. So this thing is just storm surges directly affecting the people's lives. That's one effect of climate change, where climate change is manifested directly, suddenly, in a spike. We'll come to another sort of effects in there, but before, we'll talk about this. So coastal flooding prediction through 2070, these are the major towns and cities in India and different places of Asia Pacific. Mumbai and Kolkata in India, in China, Guangzhou and Shanghai, Bangladesh, Dhaka, like this. So these are the major cities. Each one of them, I'm pretty much sure they got populations more than 1 million and still counting. So these places are located near the sea, but these places are going to be flooded. It means predictions are there, they're going to suffer from severe flooding. Rapid urban sprawl and modification of natural coastal ecosystem. The way we have changed the thing, there is little capacity for the beach lines, the shorelines, to respond to climate change in a natural way. It's generally believed that the natural systems got their own ways to deal with changes in environmental parameters. But the way we have modified these things, we have little scopes for them.
And in all these countries indicated here, India, China, Bangladesh, Thailand, rapid urbanization is going on. They're building mega cities, smart cities, but they are not taking into account some of the environmental parameters that should be taken into account in light of climate change. So what's going to happen is that a lot of areas will be affected by these climate change scenarios, and because there are certain modifications which needs to be taken into account in their political measures, in their laws, in their policies, which are not being taken account of, and so we are going to face the consequences of that if this still continues.
Okay, this one gives you a little map of what are the areas, what are the coastal areas, which coastal areas are most affected or are more prone to sea level rise in the next couple of decades, which show the entire coastal area, west part, southeastern part, everything is pretty prone. Those red lines, those thick red lines, those mark that which are the areas where we are expecting more storm surges, or we have already experienced some huge storm surges in there. I'll show you one more slide before we move on to something. So we kind of know by this time that what the major causes of sea level rise is warming and polar thaw. But the problem is this: in 2013, IPCC, anybody knows what IPCC is? Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Basically, this is the place which does all kind of future prediction modeling on climate change. IPCC won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 because of their at least giving out a rough layout how the climate of the world is going to change through 2100. So in 2013, IPCC came up with an estimate of mean sea level rise, which they're saying that between 30 centimeter to 100 centimeter by 2100. Immediately, 3 years later, they say that no, our projections were kind of wrong. We're expecting that that there might be a rise of about 2 to 3 meter by the end of the century. That's one of the dicey things about this whole climate change deal. Means the climate model that holds good for today, this week, this month, it might not be good enough again for the next month. So climate models, they are constantly changing. That makes the job of the scientists or policymakers so difficult. As I keep saying, it's kind of difficult to predict. Whatever we got so far is rough prediction. Whatever models for city or sustainability or whatever we are coming up with is based on those rough models, rough numbers. But that's the best guess that we have. So we got to go along with that. I just want to show you this one. This is the largest ice cap or ice shelf or ice sheet that broke off from northern Antarctic Peninsula just last year in February. It's called the Larsen Sea. It's two of his brothers and sisters, Larsen A and Larsen B, broke off in mid-90s and early 2000s. But this one is the largest one so far in the human history. 1 trillion tons, about 6,000 square kilometers, twice the volume of Lake Erie, equal to 4 Delhis. Delhi is the capital city of India. So the main reason why we wanted to show is that if this thing keeps going on, if that amount of snow or ice turns into sea water, it's going to flood a lot of places. But that's what happened. That's
1
what's really
trillion
happening.
tons. Can you imagine the volume of water that it's going to release?
You know, it's not like that crack formed in a night, in a day or something. That fissure was forming for a substantial period of time. Unfortunately, it's like we had to do certain things for our sustainable development, for our science, for our progress, which brought to this one. Now, there are several of this one, smaller, bigger, but this one been biggest so far in human history, I guess, Larsen Sea. So it's still floating in the sea somewhere, somehow, but it's gonna get into the ocean soon, maybe next 5 years or 6 years, something. Okay, so far, any question? So we're going to move on to, okay, anybody heard about Millennium Development Goals or Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, what is Millennium Development Goal? MDG. Speak up, guys.
They were from like 2000, was it, to 2015?
Okay.
And there was 8 of them. Yeah.
Yes, right.
And they were mainly about like social development. And then when it came to 2015, they created ones more about environment as well and social development. And there's 17, I think, now.
Right. Is anybody else want to add? Well, what she said is roughly correct. It's Millennium Development Goal. There are a certain number of goals. It was basically meant to measure quantitatively the progress of the world in different spheres of life, progress of different countries in different spheres of life. By 2010, 2012, they figured out it's not working. We got to bring up more intensive schemes to measure the world's development or progress quantitatively by number. So they brought up this one, what they call Sustainable Development Goal, SDG. Previously, there were 8 of them, now they got 17. The time frame from Millennium Development Goal was about 1990 to 2015. Now this one has been given to us with a time frame of 2015 to 2030. What we couldn't achieve, 8 goals we couldn't achieve in 25 years, we're expecting we'll be achieving 17 goals in 15 years. Right. So what she said that there wasn't any mention explicitly of environment or climate in Millennium Development Goal. But at the beginning of 2000, we started figuring out that climate change by itself should be a goal. Now, if you look at this goal, there are 17 goals in there.
Which one explicitly talks about climate change? Goal number 13, right? That explicitly talks about climate change. But if you look at the 17 goals, can you tell us like which goal is not related to climate change here? based on what we are seeing today, which one of these goals is not related to climate change, directly or indirectly?
16,
Peace and justice,
17.
peace and
Peace,
justice,
justice, and
partnership.
strong institution. Huh?
Quality education.
Okay, let's talk about 16 first. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. Do you think that is not related to climate change? That is related to climate change because nowadays there's a lot of conflicts due to climate change. You know, people are murdering each other due to climate change because they're climate refugees. So there's not equity for among climate people who are suffering from climate change. So that is actually indirectly related to climate change. Yes, else?
Gender equality?
Gender and equality, that's goal 5, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is not related to climate change.
Is everyone agree with that?
Okay, if yes, why? If no, why? Just don't shake it. Just tell us why.
I think the argument that all related to climate change, because the purpose of the SDGs is that, like, it's sustainability, and like climate is inherently linked to that because where we live, it's what we eat from, it's a livelihood for a lot of people. It's, like, I think you can make the argument that everything is linked to climate change in the
How is
17 goals.
gender equality
So
related?
gender equality, I
Okay.
know that like in parts, for example, in parts of Africa, women are required to like get water and stuff. So like climate change, when that changes, because the burden is on them, they have to work.
So they don't go to school, you know.
It's
small
not only
kids
there,
don't
not
go to
only in
school.
sub-Saharan Africa, Sahel or sub-Saharan Africa, in India too. Women
Girl
in
child, yeah.
more dry regions of the country, like northwestern part, women are typically required to go collect water every day. With climate change, okay, normal days in normal with climate change not being there, they still, in many occasions we saw that they got to walk back and forth about 10 miles every day to get 3 buckets filled up. Because most of the townships or villages, they don't have a sustainable supply of water source there. So basically they got to go to the next township or next village to get the water. Now the way it works is my village, my place, my water, my people first, so we got to stand in queue. So you stand in there for 2-3 hours just to come up top at the front of the queue to get only 3 pitchers of water. Now these people got about a family of like 10 people. 3 pitchers of water, it's not go away. So you got to go back, put the buckets back, come back again, couple of times. So the whole day, literally the whole day goes away just to collect water. They don't have time for themselves. Forget education, forget health, forget rituals, anything.
We need the girl child in the family don't get to go to school because she has a responsibility of going with her mother to fetch this water with her. So the sons will go to school, but the girl child will not go to school and go and fetch water.
If you guys have time on yourself, you guys can start a YouTube typing water wives. Water wives means people are marrying more than once, twice, thrice, just so that they will be having enough workforce at home who can go and collect more water. It's gross to think about, but it's true.
And again, because of climate change, we have a scarcity of food because food security is threatened to a great extent. So you know, whatever good food you have in the family goes again to the male members of the family. Because this society is a patriarchal society. Like in the developing nations, most are the patriarchal society. So you know, the men get to have the good food. So even pregnant women, even children, they don't get sufficient and nutritious food. They suffer from malnutrition. They suffer from all kind of water-related diseases and everything. So it's the gender equality comes in there. So it's because of climate change that we see a lot of disparity among male and female people here. Again, which ones again do you think is not related to climate change?
Maybe 17, because that's kind of...
17 partnerships for the goals. Okay, what does it mean by that? A partnership.
like international connection, I guess, to work together.
Yes.
True. So we got to, goal 17 means how well the countries are connected to get to the sustainability or something. These days what's happening for the small nations, for the developing nations, the low-income nations, there is a specific jargon for these least developing countries, LDCs. Now they don't have enough financial background, technology, manpower, skill, knowledge, support. They cannot come up with climate action strategies themselves. So they got to depend on international aid, international global partnerships. So that some other people or some other countries will come in and help them with this kind of skill and techniques. So it's, if you think about it, this climate action, the way climate action came up in our life is that you can put it at the center of a big wheel, and all these wands will radiate from that like a spokes. It's like the spokes of a bicycle wheel or something. Means that's the way climate action or climate change being related to different aspects of life right now. We'll just go briefly about the major climate change goal. SDG goal 13.1. So SDG goal 13 is climate action out there. So under these goals, they have got 3 sub-goals. One is strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazard natural disasters. Goal 2, 13.2 says integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. Goal 3 says improve education, awareness raising, capacity building. When you look at these 3 goals, goal 13.1, that is sitting up on top, strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity. We cannot have 13.1 without having 13.2. Will you say yes or no? We cannot have 13.1 without having 13.2.
Yeah.
We cannot have 13.2 without 13.3. Unfortunately, everybody is focusing on 13.1. So the debate mainly is whether we should take as a bottom-up approach or top-down. 13.3 says improve education, awareness raising, capacity building. Still in India, Asia Pacific region, Sub-Saharan Africa, if they are having trouble to grow the crops, you go talk to them, they will say, oh, this year the rains were bad, the weather was not conducive. So at the same time, they will say, okay, this season was weird, this season we didn't get much rain, next season it will be good enough. Now is the time to tell them that what you are looking at is not weather, you're looking at climate. There is a fundamental difference between weather and climate. Anybody knows that?
What is weather and what is climate?
Should we ask them?
Weather's local, climate's like overall trends usually.
Okay, so that's pretty much it. Weather is daily basis, maybe weekly or monthly. Climate is a long-term average. Generally, it's taken 30 years norm.
3 days.
30 years norm. So that's climate. But in India, Bangladesh, Asia Pacific, people are still, means the grassroots level farmers are still pretty much unaware that what we are looking at is not fluctuation in weather. It's permanent change in climate. The rain goes away, it goes away for good unless you do something. Even then, it's kind of difficult to bring back the rain to the same level again. You've got to adjust your soil properties, your cropping patterns, so that you can kind of balance off the effect of the low rainfall. But that's one thing, improve education, awareness raising, capacity building. We are yet lacking that thing. But without that, strengthen resilience, adaptive capacity, it's not going to work. So in a lot of the spheres of policy making and management decisions, we are kind of lagging behind.
You know, we don't have enough warning systems in the developing nations. You know, a lot of these calamities could have been avoided to some extent if we had good warning systems, but unfortunately we don't have that. So whatever little we could have saved, we cannot save that. We don't have, as he said, we don't have crop insurance, we don't have weather insurance, which makes people go into debts because to recover from these things. So these things are some of the things that should be integrated into the national policies, into the laws, but unfortunately we are still lacking here. We are going ahead making plans, but again, as I said, to make these plans and to make them and to implement these plans, we need a lot of financial support, which again a lot of the developing nations are lacking. We need financial support from the developed nations to go ahead and work on these plans.
Okay, we don't have much time to move on with this thing. Okay, now we are getting into the social aspects. So far, whatever we have told you is that if I say that, if I want to summarize this thing, that people who are closest to nature, closest to environment, who has to practically depend on environment for their livelihood practices, those are the people who are most vulnerable to climate change. Will you agree? So now comes the question of social justice, human rights, right to environment. We'll be talking about different types of human rights that kind of, in a roundabout way, relates to climate change. We'll be talking a little bit about national security too. First thing is human rights. The first one, means we're calling it climate change. Is it at all an issue of human rights? A right to an environment of particular good quality. Unfortunately, as far as we know, we do not have a definite mandate for environmental protection or degradation. What we have right mandates for different smaller things which kind of comes together in a collective way which we call environment as a whole. But environment of a particular quality, we don't have any human rights mandate in there. For example, we have mandate for our right to life, which takes into account everything that we know of. It says that everyone has a right to life, liberty, security of person, rights shall be protected by law, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his or her life. The last sentence, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his or her life. When you think about climate change, now climate change can impact this thing, right to life, in two different ways. One, if it is cyclone or typhoon or landslide, life is gone in a sudden spike. But what happens, what's more deadlier and dangerous than that is what lagging effects climate change leaves behind, that cyclone or typhoon, that keeps taking away livelihood in a slow process before we start to really realize it. So climate change, basically it comes in way of right to life. If we think that that is a basic right, that we have to have in our life for a good life, climate change is taking it away. Next one, right to adequate food of particular quality. Right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself, his or her family, including adequate food, clothing, housing. Now, strange thing is that it says that right to adequate food of particular quality, but at the same time, it's not just talking about food, it's talking about clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions, which shows that when you are talking about climate change and how climate change is coming in our way of living a life, you cannot take one thing out of the equation and go ahead and fix that one thing. Things are related to each other in such a way you got to solve 5 simultaneous equations simultaneously. It's not like that you are solving for 3x's, there are 4 equations, you are solving for 3x's or 1x, the remaining 3x's are known. In here, if there are 3 equations, all 3 x's are unknown. That's kind of challenging. What climate change does, increased temperature accelerates grain sterility. Basically, it's prolonged germination period. Seeds are never going to germinate or germinate pretty slow. Shift in rainfall pattern render productive land infertile. Soil loss, soil productivity loss, soil degradation, reduced cropping. Rising sea levels makes soil salty. Crops can grow. So basically, in a roundabout way, direct way or roundabout way, climate change coming in the way of this one, right to adequate food quality. We cannot have it. A right to health. We've been talking about, she's been talking about right to health, about malaria and dengue, all the vector-borne, waterborne diseases that are recurring through time. In recent times, have been recurring pretty frequently. So that's a way how climate change is coming our normal life, how it's affecting our normal life. Joint study by London School of Hygiene says that over 1,600 deaths a year from malaria and malnutrition, and could double by 2020. Now this study was done in 2010, so I'm guessing we are already there. In this part of the world, in India, malaria and dengue, these are 2 huge concerns. Even within the country, this place, so this place of the country is typically prone to dengue. vector-borne disease or something. Don't tell anybody I told you this. Okay. Lose my job.
No, dengue is, it became an epidemic last year in certain parts of India. A lot of people lost their lives from dengue, and it's a life-threatening disease. I mean, if your platelet count goes down, it just goes down like anything. Every day it's going down, and so people just lost their lives. I mean, in 2017 we did not have a control over dengue. There's no vaccination for dengue as such. So it was an epidemic last year, and it's because of the rising temperatures. Malaria, these mosquitoes, it favors their germination. So what happened is that they germinated like anything, and it was deadly. I hope it doesn't recur the next year, and things are better the next year. But let's see.
Well, it was almost that way, which we remember last semester we had a course we were teaching the largest group of GSLA students, the Jindal in the last one. So we had a midterm submission. We told the students to submit it. There is no joke, no kidding. That is submit. 10 of 70 students made the day before submission. We have data.
Yeah, there was it. Was.
Are you kidding? You can't do this. If you'd say that my computer crashed, that would have been better. But it was almost that way. It was almost that way at that time. That I have dengue. What's your name? I have dengue. Okay. Means it's a joke. Okay. Don't tell anybody I said this. Don't ever tell anybody.
They were joking, right? Like not joking, but they just said.
Yeah, no, but it was serious. They had
It was serious. It was serious. We seriously had this thing. We seriously had this thing. Because one of the major problems in here, not only in this part. Alright guys, give me attention for another half hour. Okay. The next one is right to clean, sustainable water supply and source. Unfortunately, we didn't have this law, means this human right mandate until 2002, when people started realizing that that one thing, water supply and source, goes ahead and connects so many different spheres of life, that right to water, safe, sustainable quality of water should be by itself a right. But as precipitation becomes more weird, temperature rises, recharge to groundwater bodies declines, stream flow regimes change. The thing that we were talking just now, that women have to travel longer distances now just to collect the normal quota of water. Because of this, because groundwater levels are dropping, stream flow levels are changing. It's a huge issue in the Asia-Pacific region as much as an issue in the sub-Saharan Africa. She was talking about violent conflicts. Now conflicts, as I said, means a person from this town or village going to collect water to other town and village. It's obviously a situation giving rise to a conflict. It's my town, my water, my place, my people gets water first. Right to, this is one of the most interesting and exciting things to me actually, because I've been working on this. Right to indigenous people. In India, Asia Pacific, Africa, or whatever, it's the same thing. Indigenous people view their land, their water, their forest, their plant, animal as their actual home. So if any harm comes to any of these things, they think that we cannot live on no more. But what climate change is doing, killing off the trees because of forest fire, degrading the soil, their plants can grow, their livestock is taking off. So basically it's one of the major problems of the indigenous people, that their home is being gradually taken off from them. But unfortunately we don't really feel that until these people come up with a violent riot or protest, that enough is enough, stop it. We have seen these things before in India, and these things are recurring pretty frequently now. That how far can you push us, or how far do you want to push us? This is all that we have. There is no forest left. If you're pushing us farther behind, forest line ends in there. We cannot go any more behind. But that's what's happening. So what we are talking about, social unrest, social chaos, it's basically of this. Knowingly or unknowingly, the people, the bulk of the population who are already kind of pushed back to the margins of the society, the vulnerable people, the marginalized people who are in constant touch with the atmosphere, with the environment, who depend on the environment, we're not thinking much about them. if you look at this one, we like to believe that we are at the center of a successful transition to a world far-reaching and balanced global reductions. So all big terms in there, what it means that we like to console ourselves by saying that we have devised enough mitigation, adaptation things which will help us reducing fossil fuel burning. But when we do that, not for one moment we think whether the mitigation adaptation policies that we are designing are going to account for the entire clan, entire group of people, the society as a whole, or is it only targeted for a selected group of people? Who does climate change affect the most, what we've been talking about?
Who do you think climate change affects the most? The big sector, the core sector, right? Who does not have much money, you know, so the privileged sectors can still adapt to situations, but it's a poor section, it's difficult for them to adapt to these situations because you need money for these things.
It's pretty much the same way. Means people have been starting to argue that what the developed nations did one day, we are suffering the consequences now. So if you take it, the whole world is then split, development. Even if you take a small community, it's basically a difference between high income, middle income, and low income groups. So you can come up with your fancy ideas of climate mitigation strategies, climate response actions. But the question is whether you can uniformly apply those actions to the all parts of the society at all or not. Will it kind of bring up more and deep disparity in the society? What we need today is basically specific attention to the most vulnerable groups, because this is the bulk of the population that we have, 70%, in most of the countries, 70%. If we are not bringing them into the mainstream of climate action, we are not solving much things, recognizing their roles in crafting solutions and increasing resilience. So the question is, when we are talking about a resilient society, resilient community, are we taking into account that there are certain groups of people who cannot never be resilient? Goal of this climate transitions must include fulfillment of their basic needs, realization, enjoyment of their human rights, their health, education, equity, social protection. And finally, we have to create some scope, some opportunities in there so that they can have decent work and life as a whole.
Now, how can we bring this, like, is it possible to bring this social dynamics into climate change policies? Is it possible? Theoretically or practically, is this possible? You know, to bring, you know, to give, to have equity. I mean, there's no disparity. Is it possible to do that?
To achieve it.
It is really tough, right? Yeah.
Means one of the major solutions we come up with is that, okay, stop burning fossil fuel, come up with clean fuel stuff, CNG or something, or whatever it is. But just think about this, people who have been burning woods or wants to convert to charcoal or something, it's kind of cheap. You go to forest, you log it up and you can get your firewood. You ask them to do this thing that, okay, forget firewood from now, got to preserve the forest, you got to move from fossil fuel to clean energy. Okay, fine, but do they have enough money to do that? No, we can't. So when we are applying, when we are asking that, okay, India will become a climate-proof nation in 2050. That's a goal we have set to ourselves. But the question is, does that mean a certain fraction of India is going to be climate-proof? If we move on, what we're saying here that, okay, anybody knows what UNFCCC is? Yeah. If you say yes, you have to say. Oh God.
Is it United Nations something on climate change?
It has to be, there's no doubt. But I'm more after that something.
United Nations.
I'm more after that something.
F. Okay.
Framework?
Framework.
Then,
Convention on
Climate
controlling
change.
climate change.
Control.
Combating
Okay.
climate change corporation.
let's strike a balance between everybody. We strike a balance. Okay. So it's United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change.
Oh, it's a framework convention.
Okay. So, okay. UNFCCC Article 1. So So this United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, it is the boss organization for climate change all over the world. It was formed in 1992 with the Rio Conference. The main goal was that every country enlisted in the United Nations, they got to report their actions, their development, their progress to UNFCCC annually to figure out what else they need to do. So this guy sits up top to figure out if everything is going on well or not. So the first article of UNFCCC says that any climate change policy addressing the adverse impacts of climate change should integrate consideration of potential impacts on people. Now that's a huge thing, that's a vast thing, because when you're talking about integrate consideration of potential impacts on people, you've got to consider the entire range of possibilities. It's not just the direct impact. If these people are located at a sea beach, on a seashore, cyclone, typhoon, all these guys are dying, bad to say. But that's the direct impact. That's kind of visible thing, you can put your hands on it. You've got to take into account the whole range of things, and we will come to that in a minute. The second one, Article 4, it talks about more important things, minimize adverse effects of climate policies related to either mitigation or adaptation. So mitigation, adaptation, climate response, that is very nice, but whether those things are coming in the way of social life or not. Means we devise mitigation and adaptation strategies so that climate shouldn't be coming in way of living our normal social life. But if this mitigation, adaptation by themselves come in the way of social life, then that's bad. But that's what UNFCCC is saying, that you've got to devise your action plans in such a way so that it doesn't come. So what we need today is a thorough critique on the main social drivers of climate change, how they play out in different processes, integrating our environment with social dynamics and job.
So it's a socio-economic, socio-cultural, socio-political, everything goes hand in hand here. So now environment is such a thing that it is not a standalone thing. You have to take into account, as I told you, socio-economic factors, socio-cultural factors, socio-political factors. And this is what this slide talks about, that these things are like, all these things integrated together, the economic sector, the social sector, and the environmental sector. And these things should be approached together to have satisfied within a unified framework to benefit the vulnerable communities. Not only the vulnerable communities, it's to benefit everyone. These things should go hand in hand.
One thing I would say that if you look at this figure out there, there is social, economic, and environmental. Now there are small bullet points in there. You can go ahead and put in more bullets. Whatever you can think of in your social life, in your life in general, it might come under one of these points. Or if you look carefully in those small bullets in there, you can place one bullet under each banner. Means water security, which comes under environmental things. Water security can feed into social life, it can go for economic standards. So these things can go under one banner or at the same time all three banners. So that's a more difficult thing. But as I was saying, so there are three simultaneous equations in there which got to be solved at the same time. You cannot fix the environmental issues without fixing the social or economic issues. The same way, economic and social issues cannot be fixed without the environmental thing. So we got to view, when you are devising any kind of adaptation mitigation strategy, you got to view a composite, a collective social thing, where smaller pieces come together to give rise to a bigger thing. But not only that, then you got to fix about political dynamics. You got to think about whether my nation, my community, my society got right political will to develop right policy measures. So it's not just one or two things. That's a thing, this is a thing which makes climate change so dicey, and for the policymakers to push it off. The concept that, okay, we'll talk about climate later, let's just fix this thing and that. It's a really kind of stupid thing to do. Means that the way climate has came up in our life, that we cannot avoid climate change no more. We're talking about job, we're talking about health, we're talking about education, we're talking about law enforcement. you got to think about the climate change, the environmental effects of climate change. So if we have to promote the human potential to its full, we got to think how the little pieces come together in a bigger picture. In a simple way, if you look at this diagram here, with climate change we got environmental degradation. With environmental degradation, resource scarcity, resource competition. As soon as we get resource competition, now resource competition can be between people, between our individual person, between communities, between societies, between individual smaller states and districts, between nations. Now once we have it, we kind of trigger in a cycle. One cycle is our disparity. Now there can be already existing disparity in a community, in a society, in a nation. Climate change, resource-led competition can trigger in new disparities in there. Some people got everything, some people got more of everything, some people got none of nothing. So that's a disparity. Disparity generally feeds into our conflict, social chaos, unrest and conflict, aggression, violence. There are conflicts in terms of moral and ethical terms, decadence of society, and finally it's difficult to enforce the law. Moral and ethical grounds, that these people got nothing, they're shouting, they're yelling, they're demonstrating. How strictly we can enforce the law, or shall we enforce the law at all? One of the major strategies to all this is migration, what she started talking about in the beginning. Now migration is a major coping strategy, but there are different issues related to migration. One, migration can be internal or okay, anybody in here doing migration studies or something? I saw your brochure, your school brochure. There's a huge wing of migration studies.
Which AU or UNSW?
UNSW.
Doing what it is for relations.
In general, migration can be both internal or external. We are moving from Delhi to Bombay, so that's internal migration. External, from Bangladesh to India. That's a huge migrant problem now. It's a huge migrant influx. The border between India and Bangladesh, it's not seen either. So it's internal or external, temporary or permanent. How long are you going to stay in there? It's a domain of your basic human perception. That do you think this extreme, the impacts of this extreme weather event is going to be over soon? Can you come back? Temporary or permanent. But all the time when you are going for migration, there is a comparative assessment between where you are and where you are going. How about political dynamics in the new place? How about the language? How about the food? How about job? How about your staying there? Can you buy a house or rent house? So this is a chain sequence, one moving into another, through another, coming out. So everything, I'm not saying that this can be solved with sensitive policy intervention. You know, certain things are problems, we know there are problems, they will remain as problems. But at least these days the major question is, at least can we start to recognize these as problems? We still lack this thing. It means one of the major issues is global security. When we're talking about conflict and migration, those two things, it obviously leads to global security issue. At least national security issue. International Alert is a huge NGO, it keeps tracks of all the conflicts happening all over the world in recent times. Says 46 countries home to 2.7 billion. Impacts of climate change will create high risk for violent conflict. Conflict means, as I say, major conflict is environmental degradation, resource scarcity, resource-led competition. That's the first round of conflict and competition begins. Second round of conflict and competition begins when you apply the climate response actions. Some people, rich people become richer, poor become poorer. That's another round of conflict begins in there. When you move from this country to next, or this state to next, this district to next, that's another round of conflict. So 46 countries, 2.7 billion already under high risk of conflict. 56 countries, the institutions of government will have greater difficulty taking the strain of climate change on top of their own challenges. Unfortunately, a number of these countries are in Asia Pacific. It's almost equal in Sub-Saharan Africa and India. In Asia Pacific. In Sub-Saharan Africa, Sahel region, communal conflict, transboundary, transnational conflicts has become a routine case now. It's always going on in there. But through all this, a major question is climate change by itself doing everything? Or is it the state itself who had numerous problems beforehand, numerous loopholes which are being exposed by climate change? So it's a huge area of research all over the world now, that to what extent climate change triggers conflict or migration, or climate change acts as a threat multiplier kind of thing. They had a disparity, economic drawdown, things. Now climate change came in, extreme weather event came in and exposed it a bit more. Problem is, to date, socioeconomic, sociocultural implications of climate change have received little attention, especially in the developing nations, low-income groups, even within the nation, low-income groups. Same token, resource costs of climate change is increasingly threatening fundamental human rights.
Only past 1990 we have been concerned so much about climate change, and that also after 1990 it was the developed nations who became more concerned. 1972 there was a convention in Montreal which talked about global emissions and how it's on the rise, but it's only after 1990 when people started seeing data that these global emissions are huge, and if we don't put a stop on these emissions, it's going to create a calamity. But still people, developed nations, still they took some actions to do it. But developing nations, it's not that the developing nations have done something, but it's more of the developed nations, transiting work to the developing nations, and so the emissions and everything have gone up recently, it's huge. So in 2015, when there's the Paris Climate Change Summit, everyone has heard about it. We all agreed that we have to bring emissions to less than 2 degrees. If global temperature is less than 2 degrees, if temperatures go above 2 degrees centigrade, it's going to have huge impacts on the people. And already, you know what the emissions have gone up till now? 2017, where have the emissions gone up to? Where are we? It's 1.7 degrees already. So we are a 0.3 degree centigrade difference, and we know we cannot stop it. It's going to go up unless there's a miracle. So we don't know what's going to come. Everyone says that by 2050 there's going to be huge changes, and we are seeing some of the changes. But how it's going to affect us, we are going to see. A lot of it's not that there's been a lot of adaptation and mitigation strategies have been taken up, but still a lot needs to be done here. So as I said, the socio-economic, socio-cultural, socio-political, everything needs to come hand in hand to solve this problem. It's not a individual problem now. It's an integrated problem and needs to be solved taking into account a whole lot of things.
Does everybody know about what happened with the Paris Climate Treaty? Okay, if you say yes, you have to say yes. If you shake your head this way, you got to speak up. If you're saying this way, that's fine. What was the major issues with Paris Treaty? Why did Donald Trump walk out?
You place some responsibility on developed countries.
Okay, that's one. Is there anything else? Does anybody know that US walked out of the Kyoto Protocol as well? Anybody knows Kyoto Protocol? So these are the different global protocols, how to mitigate greenhouse gas effects, to address the greenhouse gas effects. Kyoto Protocol was the first one, came up with a matrix of mandates with more stringent mandates. Paris Treaty, it was more loose kind of thing, more legit. So each country was expected to submit their own goals for the next 10, 15 years. But one thing that you guys say that it was coming on the developed nations totally, which is not true. Which is not true. Is there any context?
Can you just guess?
Yeah, sure.
So was it just
Throughout climate change, all the climate studies is based on guess.
Oh, okay.
What we are doing is the best guess.
Okay. So why the US walked out?
Means what were the major issues with means at that time it was a huge row at the time.
Yeah.
Everybody was talking about Paris Treaty, why Donald Trump walked out, and this and that.
Wasn't it? I don't remember, but maybe because doesn't US produce like doesn't US have one of the highest like carbon footprints, and it produces like most, and it's like manufacturing and all that produces most of the carbon emissions, and if like he agreed to the Paris Treaty, basically in the entire like 2016 elections where he was like, jobs will be given back to like, and like the industrial revolution will come back to America, like that whole narrative would be completely counterproductive if he like agreed to the Paris Treaty, because
True.
industry
Yes.
would suffer.
That was the thing, is that one of the major necessities, major demands of the Paris Treaty is that got to stop fossil fuel burning right now. But the question was whether the developed nations should stop burning it first or the developing. Now the major point that Donald Trump came up with is that it's India and China who are burning fossil fuel the most, and before that they formed a fund, kind of a international fund which is called Green Climate Fund, to which all the developed nations will contribute or had contributed before the treaty, from which the developing nations will get loans to devise their technologies, devise their climate action plans. What Trump was saying that India and China already drew enough amount of loans from this green climate fund, but they haven't done anything until they have stopped their fossil fuel burning. We won't do nothing. We won't sign up to Paris Treaty. But as she pointed out that, but what was happening that global per capita fossil fuel emission is highest in the States. In total, when you take the whole thing, the national GHG emission picture, China tops the list. There is no doubt. But global per capita emission of GHG, in terms of that, States top the list. But I don't know, means there was some political commitments or industrial commitments, economic commitments or something. He was violent about this thing that unless India and China does it, we'll not do this. The problem is this: one country walks out of a deal, that's not a big deal actually. It should be a big deal. But this country is the largest funding source of UN. China and Russia pitches in sporadically. So if this country walks out, well, Trump is trying to broker a deal back into the Paris Treaty again, which is not going to be so easy. But that was the main thing, that you got to stop burning fossil fuel now, but the argument strangely was until China and India stops it, will not do it. Okay, we can talk about this after the presentation if we need.
Yeah.
We'll just briefly touch upon this one, climate change action in Indian policy making. So India came up with this strange thing in 2008 during one of the debated government that we had. It's called National Action Plan for Climate Change, NAPCC. So all the countries are expected to come up with such kind of national action plans towards climate with definite mandates for different sectors or in the environment and climate. So it's a national solar mission, mission for enhanced energy, sustainable habitat, water mission. So all these missions, means if you look at these missions break up almost daily life in 7-8 pieces. 7 pieces. The last one, National Mission for Strategic Knowledge for Climate Change. To me, the last one is the most important today, because unless we know what's been done or what could be done based on statistical projections, we can't do much. But what these missions say from 1 to 7 is that the basic idea is that sure we'll move from a fossil fuel intensive world to a clean fuel world. Water mission, we will try to conserve our water in such a way that we can rip up the benefits in the summer months, the leaner months. Green India, we got to plant more trees. It's a deforestation, afforestation thing. Sustainable agriculture. So in that one, a major thing is that how we can conduct research to come up with more drought-tolerant species. So basically this whole thing, National Solar Mission, we are in the process, at least some parts of India, some cities or some regions of some cities of India, we are moving from fossil fuel or traditional energy source to solar energy, wind energy, water energy. But as I say, when you look at this mission, say for example, National Solar Mission, a mission for enhanced energy efficiency, mission 1 and 2, these missions demands a lot of infrastructure, a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, skill and technology. Again, if we come back to the social issues of life, how much can the vulnerable, marginalized people afford these things? We haven't, unfortunately the government hasn't come up with any kind of ideas how these things can be built into everyday life of the vulnerable, marginalized people. This is still on an experimental basis that maybe some of these things will work, some of these will won't. But these are the action plans that India has. Now
when we talk about the mission on sustainable habitat, that mission takes care about the public transport system, that people should use more public transport, and it also takes into care waste management, which is a huge issue in India. Sustainable waste management policies, that is included into the third mission, which is a mission on sustainable habitat. Yeah, and as he said, the 8th mission is most important because it is about raising awareness. It's about teaching people. It's technology transfer, setting up the infrastructure, capacity building, everything that comes under the 8th goal, which is very important in India because most people in a country like India, because most people are not aware of the consequences. What they are doing is bad for the environment. It's bad for themselves. It's going to come back to them in a few years. That kind of awareness is still not there. So that in that way, the 8th goal is probably the most important goal, educating people.
One of the things is that still in India and many developed nations that the most frequented argument among common people is that if I stop doing this, will the world change? If I stop burning fossil fuel, if I stop throwing plastic waste, will the world change? Now we are seriously lacking, I guess as she said, throughout the world is the problem that we got to do some serious awareness building, capacity building to tell people that it's not you alone when you consider yourself in a society or community, it's you means 100. But in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka is the problem. That if I stop doing this, will the world change? Or better one is this, okay, if you are so aware of this thing, you are so educated, why don't you stop? I'm the only person doing it. So I'm not going to damage the society much. There are 30 people in the community, 29 of them agreed to doing this or agreed to not doing this. I'm the only person, can you leave me alone? So that's the thing. But this thing has to change. So what we need a framework of understanding of the social dimensions of climate change. Incorporate them really, so not just on books and papers. Incorporate them into climate change dialogues and policies. We cannot just come up with climate policies based on climate science. That's very good. Climate science should form the backbone of the policies. But then the flesh, the veins and everything, it should be formed by the social aspect, the socio-cultural, socio-political aspects of climate change. Bring climate response plans into mainstream national sustainable development paradigms. Still now, when we are talking about sustainable development, sustainable goals, we barely think about climate change. When we go ahead, try to implement the development paradigms, then we figure out that, oh my God, so there is a lot of climate change happening in here, the water is going down, we are losing water, we cannot apply this plan, so we got to come up with stopgap plans all the time. So how about including the climate beforehand and not waste time and money and manpower in it? So we will end our presentation with a few questions that we also have in our mind. We keep talking about natural versus anthropogenic climate change, that the sources of greenhouse gases, whether they're natural or anthropogenic, to what extent are they natural, to what extent they're anthropogenic? Is there a mix?
What is anthropogenic?
Man-made.
Something that is induced by humans. So do you think climate change can be natural? By what? Like what?
I mean, we have this, like the science, and the history says that climate has changed historically.
Yes.
So to some extent, I do think that's just like a natural change, but we're like worsening it.
right?
So mostly yes. You have something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, historically the climate has changed quite often and that's normal. It's just, with this particular instance, it's changed at such an incredibly high rate,
Right.
different from history, so it is definitely.
Which could not just be natural. You know,
Yeah,
some
that's
people
the-
pointed out that maybe solar radiation. You know, the sun's the sun's heat has just gone up. You know, the heat from the sun has just gone up, and it's creating this global rise. Why didn't you take that into account? So the NASA actually did some experiments, and they saw that no, the solar radiation cannot explain this sudden hike in temperature that we are seeing today. You know, ultraviolet rays from the ozone hole, no natural phenomena can explain this rise of temperature. It's definitely mostly anthropogenic. It's mostly anthropogenic, mostly caused by humans that we are seeing this spike of temperature. And post 1950s, we are measuring everything post 1950s. And mostly in the after 1970s, 1980s, you know, when the Green Revolution came in, when we started using heavy machineries, when we came up with new models of cars and everything, so more emissions, more, you know, we are using more technology, more machineries, more emissions. So we saw this sudden spike of temperature.
Basically, as you guys were saying, in the long history that we have of mankind, climate has changed naturally. Now what we're doing, we're drawing a fine line between the pre-industrial era and post-industrial era. Pre-industrial era, climate was changing, but kind of beyond our perception, slowly. Post-industrial era, if you search Google by post-industrial GHG emission something, you see that if the GHG emission graph is like this before the industrial era, there is a huge slope break. So it just kind of spikes up. So the next question that we have in mind, can social impacts of climate change be quantified? So far, whatever we told you is without numbers and values. Now, there are people, and it should be that way, there are people who say, unless you can fix some numbers, some figures with your statement, we don't believe you. So come up with some numbers. What they are doing, they are trying to set up some kind of statistical model how climate change or how maybe decline in water levels or forest fire, how that can be related to joblessness, something of that sort. So we need some numbers, we need some values. Now we know that there are effects, but we got to come up, as they call it, a scientific way of proving the statement. Third one, how will climate change impact political stability? Means what I was saying before, that whether political stability exposes the loopholes made by climate change, or climate change makes a state politically unstable. Shows you distinctly the weaknesses in the public service sector, like water services, health sector, education, something, food sector. Food insecurity makes the state unstable, frictions and conflicts. So whether this one feeds into that, this one feeds back into that, to something, whether there is a vicious loop or not. How would politically fragile states respond to climate change? States that are already going through a lot of trouble in terms of their internal conflicts, transboundary conflicts. Problem with these states is that if they are hit by a sudden climate surge, sudden weather event or something, most of their money, most of the resources, manpower, technology goes away or lost kind of thing, just to bring the nation out of that extreme climate surge. Instead, what we are thinking that the policies should be made in such a way that they should be putting some climate response actions in place beforehand. But if the state is politically fragile, it's kind of difficult to come up with this kind of action plans beforehand, because there is always a power struggle, power vacuum kind of thing. So these are we're not saying these are the only questions, but as we too been working on this thing, so these are the major questions that we're trying to do some research on. We're doing some studies, some book-based, literature-based studies, some practical work out there. But these are the major things. The second one especially, can social impacts of climate change be quantified? Can you associate numbers? Okay, I guess explicit mention of climate change in human rights mandates. That's the last one. Developing countries, low-income countries, or least developing nations, least developing countries are LDCs. They, policymakers, people in there, they recognize that human rights can be violated with climate change. But unfortunately, they don't have the right infrastructure and institution to explicitly have climate change mentioned in their policy yet. Okay, so far so good. That concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, we can.
Yes.
So, like, what, apart from the, like you mentioned some of the policies that the government has, but how does the, like, does the government justify the climate change policies with the fact that India is still building coal mines, building coal burning facilities, investing in overseas coal mines, like the top 1% of India, like a significant portion of that is entirely in steel manufacturing, power manufacturing, and stuff like that. How that shouldn't, and India was one of the only countries with high greenhouse gas emissions that's still increasing the amount of emissions.
Yes, it is.
How does the government justify, like, sort of going to the Paris Climate Accords and saying that, like, yep, we're going to do the best we can while still allowing huge investment in fossil fuel burning?
I think, okay, one way of answering this question is government doesn't try to justify it at all, because government doesn't want to think about it at all. Until and unless, as I say, some extreme weather event really hits the population, then people go on to search that what will come up with ideas that, okay, this is the amount of fossil fuel we're burning today, but this is the amount of fossil fuel we need to burn absolutely to meet up with that GDP requirement or something. Government doesn't justify it, as I say, that many of the climate response actions, climate response policies, that they have intense social dimension, political dimension, cultural dimension, it is not recognized at all. A major reason that India got to still go on burning fossil fuel is that we got to maintain our production. India is one of the countries where population is rising like sky high. Means the growth rate is enormous, really. Plus, when you consider the constant infiltration, migration from the northeast and the northwest, from Bangladesh, Myanmar, and from Pakistan and Afghanistan. So what I'm saying is that the population by nature in India is pretty high, the growth rate is pretty high. This migration issue is making them look higher. So the major argument that India is giving out is that if we have to satisfy the need of these people, we got to run the factories 24/7. If we need to run factories 24/7, we got to burn the fossil fuels. But as we showed you these missions, as we showed you these 8 missions up here, several of these missions, National Solar Mission, National Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency, National Mission on Sustainable Habitat, at least these 3 missions, these 3 things in here, they are directly or indirectly trying to address the perceived transition from fossil fuel to clean fuel.
Yeah, we are doing certain things, to give towards this transition. We do have a lot of solar power plants now. We have, hydroelectricity, nuclear, everything we are doing it. But this will take time since we are a developing nation. And as I told you before, it's all about fun zones. Don't have that fun.
That's the point that it shouldn't.
Yeah.
With such a all of the multi-billionaires in India that are invested in coal, and India already has such a high
Emission
level
rate.
of wind power, and it has the highest wind power and highest
Solar
solar power in
power,
the world.
yeah.
So
But why are they investing?
yeah, so
in
why
coal, right?
aren't there higher levies on coal production?
That is a
fund?
huge loophole
Yeah.
that we have, because we have not integrated this into our law, into our policies. These are not into our policies. So there's no law which stops you from investing into coal mines. there should be a limit to everything. You know, there should be a law or policy which says that this is the limit. You can invest up to this much, or you can go up to this much of greenhouse gas emissions. But we don't have that integrated into a law and policy, which is a need of the hour. We should integrate that into stricter laws and policies. And also, you know, it's a blame game. Every country blames the other country. Okay, you stop your emissions, then I will stop mine. So this is a blame game that is going on continuously all the
But
time.
one other problem in India is that it doesn't take into account the political scenario. India has been torn apart by its political conflict for the last 35 years. In India, the problem is that one government comes to power, thinks scientifically, brings up some laws and regulations based on numbers and values. The next government comes in and throws it right away, pitches it and says that, okay, no. This thing is coming in way of the general population big time. We got to push it back and think about it. So there is no one answer. The question that you asked me here, yes, 1% or 2% of the country which is holding the maximum of the funds, basically that is the fraction of the country who is dominating the country, ruling the country, running the country. It's kind of difficult in a country of India originally formed by conflict. It's kind of difficult to come up with one solution. In a multi-party democracy, it's kind of difficult to place a rule or come up with a regulation which will not be dumped right away with the next one. But we are moving, we are trying, we are
If
trying
we
to do the
solve this
best.
problem, India will be towards a much cleaner path here. But let's see when we can do this. We are hoping it will be soon.
We're having all fingers crossed.
Yeah. Any other question? Yes.
Yeah, like since climate change is also like displacing people and forcing them to leave their homes, there's been debate in New Zealand about like creating protocols and policies to deal with that. And I was just wondering, has India looked into anything like that, given they are going to have the most people displaced as you were saying before? So do they have any policies to deal with that number of people who have no homes?
Not yet. We just, as I say, this is the first comprehensive policy action plan that we have. This one was brought in 2008. Now this is starting point, as I say, that we are bringing up solar mission, water mission, sustainable habitats, mission for green India, everything. But now we got to get these things on the ground. See if these things are working well at all for at least a fraction of the population. Then, if yes, based on that, we got to figure out ways how we can bring maximum population under it, especially the population who are dependent on our environment directly. But this mission came out just in 2008. Believe me or not, they are already planning to scrap 2 missions from here. I'm not going to tell you which ones. But they are already planning to scrap 2 of them, thinking that those are going to be too expensive, even for the rich people. So what we suggested in here, that these social dimensions, socio-cultural dimensions, socio-political dimensions, those should be having explicit mentions in policy making. No, we haven't made any compact step towards that yet. But that's something that we need. With the whole body of the presentation, back and forth, we were talking about this, that we got to recognize first. See, climate change is something. A major problem with climate change is that it has a lagged effect. Cyclone, we had cyclone yesterday or last week. Okay, the cyclone is gone, government invested some money in disaster mitigation, but we can see the effect of climate change even 10 years from now. We don't have time. The problem is that the government doesn't have time. By that time, 2 regimes will change. That's one thing. The second thing is that climate change is yet not something on which you can put your hands. Climate change is still a theoretical, conceptual thing. So, now climate change is still a kind of abstract idea which manifests itself through deforestation or mean sea level rise or water level decline or something. But these are all these considerations, unfortunately, in India and many developing nations come after considerations for job creation, for software marketing and things. Unless this war comes to your home, we don't wake up. And it's not like just waking up by yourself. Means you got to wake up yourself and make other people wake up in such a way that they're going to be staying awake for a while until this problem is solved. Now, climate change, this thing didn't happen in a day or month or year. By the same token, it's not going to be solved in 1 year or 10 years. You got to wait to see the benefits of the policy actions that you have developed today. But who has time for that? As I say, in 10 years, 3 government regimes will change. It's unfortunate, but that's true. So these are basically what we have so far, what we need, but trying to be reasonable, realistic, how much we can do, how much we can do based upon our political condition, our socio-economic condition, with huge amount of inequity and disparity that we already have. Do you have any questions?
Okay.
Thank you so much for your attention.